A remote highway, a trusted mechanic, and countless lives shattered. Discover the chilling story of John Aykroyd, the predator who turned Oregon's backroads into his hunting grounds, and the dark secrets he hoped would stay buried forever. On the afternoon of July 10th, 1990, 13-year-old Rachanda Pickle chose to spend her day relaxing at home with her brother Byron, mother Linda, and stepfather John. Enjoying her summer break from school, she planned to catch up on her favorite TV shows while her parents were away at work. Linda later shared that she had left Rachanda, affectionately called Channy, a list of chores to do as she passed the time at home. Linda, a cleaner at a resort near Sweet Home, Oregon, had gone to work early that morning, as had John. Although the couple had divorced a year earlier, Linda had allowed John to remain in the house due to financial struggles, relying on his income as a highway mechanic for the state. The details of that afternoon remain unclear, but what is known is that John returned home early. He later explained that he had left work because a part he needed to fix a snowplow had not arrived on time, making it impossible to complete his tasks for the day. According to John, Channy had been on the sofa watching TV when he entered the family's Santiam Junction home, a small community situated at the juncture of Highway 20, referred to by some as the Lost Highway, and Oregon 22. Figuring that she was tired of hanging around the house, he suggested that they go for a drive. With a list of chores still hanging over her head, she had declined. Not wanting to waste the day, John had set off for destinations unknown, leaving Channy home alone once again. When he returned some 2 hours later, there were no signs of his stepdaughter anywhere. Later on, when John picked Linda up from work, they discussed Channy's absence, but neither of them had found her sudden disappearance concerning. Instead of leaping into action, they had gone home where they had dinner, followed by a romp in the hay at John's request. The latter was an almost unheard occurrence, owing to John's low libido. When an investigation was finally launched in the case, authorities took note of the odd timing of the rare show of intimacy. It was only after night had fallen over the valley that Linda wondered aloud if perhaps something had happened to her only daughter. She was also perplexed by the fact that Channy had neglected the chores she had been assigned. A reliable child who bent over backwards to please her mother, it wasn't like her to shirk her responsibilities. Unbothered by the odd turn of events, John had advised his former spouse to wait a day before getting law enforcement involved. And with that, the couple pushed thoughts of Channy aside and watched a movie before retiring to the bedroom. When there was still no word from Channy by the following morning, Linda phoned the police. The officer who took the report noted that there was no sense of urgency in her voice as she explained that her daughter, who was a homebody who never wandered off on her own, hadn't been seen since the previous day. When asked why she hadn't called sooner, Linda stated that she thought 24 hours had to pass before someone could be considered missing. Not that it did any good at that point, but the officer informed her that the rule did not apply to minors. A search of the family home had uncovered nothing of use to the investigation. There was no sign of a break-in, nor were there any indications that a struggle had taken place. Tellingly, none of Channy's personal belongings were missing, which led detectives to believe that, if she did leave on her own, she hadn't planned on being gone long. The investigators' curiosity was piqued when they went to have a word with the stepfather and found him furiously painting the tailgate of his truck. Seeing as how he was the last family member to see Channy before she vanished, they found his sudden need to slap paint on the vehicle more than a little suspicious. When they began posing questions to him rather than focusing on the task at hand, Aykroyd had made inappropriate comments that dealt mostly with the missing girl's physical attributes. Describing her as pretty, he had marveled at how quickly she had developed in recent months. Though he couldn't for the life of him remember her birthday, he had no trouble rattling off her bra size, despite the fact that no one had asked, as well as the last time she had menstruated. When he was shown a pair of panties that had been discovered in a wooded area not far from the house, he had become visibly aroused. Officers entered the undergarments into evidence under the assumption that they had belonged to Channy. Although they didn't have probable cause to arrest Aykroyd at the time, investigators suspected that the little girl had met with foul play at the hands of her stepfather. After speaking with some of her friends at school, they knew they were on the right track. Channy's best friend told detectives that Aykroyd had been sexually abusing her for months, if not years. The situation had become so intolerable that Channy would bring an overnight bag to school every day in the hopes that someone would take pity on her and allow her to sleep over at their house. Several of Channy's other friends corroborated the account. They added that she would often say that she was afraid of her stepfather, who abused not only her, but also her mother and brother. She feared being alone in the house with him and would go out of her way to avoid being in his presence. It was clear to detectives that she would never have stayed in the house on the day she was last seen had she known that Aykroyd would be coming home early. Investigators gleaned other disturbing facts about the inner workings of the household from acquaintances of the family who preferred to keep their names out of the news. They contended that abuse was common inside the home, most often dished out by John Aykroyd. Linda's children had both suffered regular beatings at the hands of their volatile stepfather. On more than one occasion, Channy had come to school with her eyes blackened. She would also be seen with bald patches, where portions of her hair had been forcefully yanked from her head. Since these incidents occurred back in the days when school officials weren't required to report suspected abuse, the adults who saw the girl's dire condition had simply looked the other way. When his employers learned that Aykroyd had kicked off halfway through the day, they were livid. Not only had he left without asking, he had also neglected to complete his workload. His story about being unable to repair the snowplows due to delayed parts was pure fiction. There was never any shortage of vehicles that needed fixing, something that Aykroyd, of all people, would have known. In the coming weeks, detectives would pay Aykroyd numerous visits, each interaction more bizarre than the last. Ostensibly to aid in the investigation, he would offer his theories regarding what may have taken place on the day Channy disappeared. Aykroyd speculated that his stepdaughter had been taken by surprise by someone who found her in the home, alone and vulnerable. After hitting her over the head with a blunt instrument, her abductor had tied her up and placed a gag in her mouth to stifle her screams. Once she was subdued, the stranger had taken her into the woods and assaulted her at knife point. He had then killed her and wrapped her body in plastic before dumping her in an area where she was unlikely to ever be found. Unable to hold back any longer, detectives had asked Aykroyd if perhaps he had harmed Channy by accident and disposed of her body without considering the possible repercussions of his actions. Rather than taking offense to the notion that he had killed his stepdaughter, Aykroyd hadn't seemed the least bit bothered by the suggestion. Even so, he didn't take the bait. He denied having any involvement in her disappearance, reiterating that his disturbing descriptions of what happened were purely conjecture. When the case file was presented to District Attorney Bill Hanlon, John Aykroyd's name had stood out to him like a sore thumb. He knew something that the investigators in Channy's disappearance didn't, namely that the girl's stepfather had been a person of interest in the abduction and murder of a jogger over a decade earlier. On Christmas evening in 1978, 35-year-old Kay Turner was spending a holiday getaway at Camp Sherman, Oregon, with her husband Noel and a small group of friends. Around 8:15 that morning, she decided to go for a run along the snowy country roads. When she hadn't returned by 10 o'clock, her worried husband went out to search for her. After searching the roads with no sign of Kay, a frantic Noel contacted the sheriff's office. A search was quickly organized, but Kay seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Investigators discovered 2 sets of footprints in the snow, one significantly larger than the other. Evidence at the scene indicated a violent struggle and drag marks leading away from the road. These clues pointed to the possibility that Kay had been abducted by a large man, casting doubt on her chances of survival. When detectives uncovered that Kay and Noel's marriage had been troubled, suspicion fell on him. However, their friends, who had been with them during the trip, confirmed Noel's alibi for the morning of her disappearance, and he was ruled out as a suspect. With no witnesses and no concrete evidence of foul play, the case soon went cold. Noel eventually returned to their home in Eugene, grappling with uncertainty and loss. 8 months later, a man contacted authorities in Oregon to report finding human remains in a remote wooded area. Rather than simply describing his discovery of skeletal remains and a pair of panties cut with a sharp object, the caller specifically claimed the bones belonged to Kay Turner. The caller's identification of the remains was correct, but it was information he couldn't have known at the time. Hoping to collect the substantial reward offered for information, the man readily identified himself as John Aykroyd. Coincidentally, Aykroyd had been seen near Camp Sherman the day Kay went missing. While his presence alone wasn't incriminating, given his job as a highway mechanic often brought him to the area, a witness reported seeing him drive past the spot where Kay had been jogging around the same time she vanished, raising investigators' suspicions. Aykroyd had been interviewed at the time and had freely admitted that he had seen Kay running along the side of the road. Nevertheless, he insisted that he hadn't interacted with her in any way. He would later amend this account, admitting that he had spoken with her briefly before continuing on his way. When asked what had brought him to the locale in the first place, he claimed that he had gotten off work at 6:30 that morning and decided to spend the next few hours hunting coyotes. In time, investigators would come to the macabre conclusion that deer and coyotes were Aykroyd's code words for women. Aware that he had been associated with Kay Turner's abduction and murder, detectives asked Aykroyd if he found it strange that he was the last person to see two people who had later come up missing. Unfazed, he responded that he simply had a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Knowing when to fold them, he had shut down the interview, refusing to say another word. Much to the consternation of investigators, who were certain that Aykroyd was Kay's killer, they didn't have enough evidence to take the case to trial. As much as they wanted to lock him up and throw away the key, knowing that they would have only one shot in front of a judge, they had to bide their time and hope that Aykroyd slipped up. Their day would come all right, but at a terrible price. Now, with his stepdaughter missing, Aykroyd's name was once again buzzing in the minds of law enforcement. 7 police agencies joined in the search for the little girl, to no avail. After 3 long years of looking for her in every conceivable place, the search was suspended. Determined to hold Aykroyd accountable, investigators revisited Kay's murder with renewed determination. A closer look at the extensive case file revealed that Aykroyd had spent that Christmas evening in the company of Roger Dale Beck, a man who lived near Lake Sherman. At the time, Beck's wife, Pam, told investigators the pair had spent most of the morning at their trailer home, providing an alibi that cast doubt on Aykroyd's involvement. Years later, detectives discovered that Pam had divorced Roger in 1990. Believing this might encourage her to speak more freely, they decided to track her down. This decision would ultimately change the course of the investigation. By 1993, detectives found Pam living 750 miles away in California. When asked to recount the events of December 1978, she admitted she had lied to protect her husband and Aykroyd. After carrying the secret for over a decade, she was ready to reveal the truth. Pam recounted that on Christmas morning, Aykroyd had arrived unannounced. After breakfast, he and Roger left, claiming they were going deer poaching. She didn't see them again until the following day, when they returned covered in blood. Roger's clothes were so soaked that she threw them away, fearing they'd damage her washing machine. As the men drank, their inhibitions faded, and they began boasting about raping a woman before killing her with a gunshot to the head. Realizing they had revealed too much, they threatened Pam, warning her to stay silent or face the same fate. With Pam's testimony bolstering their case, detectives sought an arrest warrant for John Aykroyd. Aware his time was up, Aykroyd surrendered without resistance. In the summer of 1993, he faced trial for the abduction, rape, and murder of Kay Turner. Shortly afterward, Roger Dale Beck was also arrested and charged. At long last, the men responsible for Kay's brutal killing were behind bars, ensuring they could harm no one else. During Aykroyd's trial, it was revealed that he and Beck had happened upon Kay as she jogged along an isolated back road. Attracted to the pretty blonde, they abducted and raped her as she begged for her life. Her pleas falling on deaf ears, they had stabbed her several times before shooting her dead. They had then butchered her remains before scattering them in the woods, confident that wildlife and the elements would take care of the rest. In what turned out to be a turning point in the trial, a schoolteacher named Jane Morris took the stand to recount how she had been biking near Lake Sherman only weeks before Kay was abducted and murdered. 24 years old at the time, she had been alone on a back road, very much like the solitary jogger from Eugene. As she was pedaling along on her way home from work, she spotted a man standing beside a pickup truck parked along the side of the road. As she grew nearer, the imposing figure pulled out a gun and ordered her to stop. Making a split-second decision that probably saved her life, she sped past him, expecting at any moment to be shot in the back. Fueled by adrenaline and fear, Jane had made it home safely. Though she had reported the incident to authorities, the gun-wielding stranger was long gone by the time they arrived on the scene. In front of a packed courtroom, Jane pointed out John Aykroyd as the man who had tried, and failed, to abduct her at gunpoint back in 1979. Aykroyd did not take the stand in his own defense, which was probably for the best. Following 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison. 3 months later, Roger Beck was convicted of aggravated murder. Though he has come up for parole at least 6 times, his attempts at freedom have thus far been rejected. Today, at the age of 73, he sits in prison, never having admitted guilt or shown any remorse for his role in Kay's murder. While authorities were pleased with the verdicts, the detectives involved in Channy's case wanted to bring closure to her family, which mainly consisted of her brother Byron, who had been her closest ally in life, and now, more than likely, in death. In 2013, after a 23-year wait, the DA presented Channy's case to a grand jury. After a careful review of the evidence, which was admittedly circumstantial, John Aykroyd was indicted for his stepdaughter's murder. When the case was finally presented to a judge and jury, Channy's mother Linda was not in attendance. Having relocated to California years earlier, she had chosen to forego the proceedings. Her biological father was also noticeably absent, as had been the norm for the duration of her short life. Only Byron, who was now 37, showed up to advocate for the sister he had loved and lost. Linda's reluctance to appear in court had come as no surprise to those who had observed her behavior after her daughter went missing. In interviews given to both the press and investigators, she had steadfastly stood behind Aykroyd. Contrary to Byron's recollections, and those of Channy's closest confidants, she claimed that she had never seen any signs that her children were being abused by the man she had brought into their lives. When it became clear early on in the trial that Aykroyd might walk due to a lack of substantial evidence, prosecutors decided to offer the defendant, who was already incarcerated for the murder of Kay Turner, a plea deal. With Byron's stamp of approval, Aykroyd pleaded no contest to Channy's murder. Although no years were added to the life sentence he was already serving, the arrangement would make Aykroyd ineligible for parole, should the opportunity ever arise. Unfortunately, despite the fact that he had admitted to taking Channy's life, he had refused to reveal the circumstances of her death or where he disposed of her body. In a bitter turn, John Aykroyd's life behind bars proved shorter than anyone had anticipated. On December 30th, 2016, a mere 3 years into his sentence, he passed away at the age of 67 from natural causes. Although Aykroyd was no longer alive, investigations into his crimes continued. Over time, his name became tied to the disappearances of at least 7 individuals and the rape of another, stretching back 4 decades before his death. In 1977, 20-year-old Marlene Gabrielson had a horrifying encounter with John Aykroyd. If authorities had taken her accusations seriously, it's possible that many lives could have been saved. The ordeal began when Marlene and her husband decided to take a short break from their responsibilities as new parents. Leaving their newborn in the care of her mother, the couple drove 90 miles from Sisters, Oregon, to attend a rodeo. As the evening wore on, Marlene was ready to head home, but her husband wanted to stay and socialize with his friends. Frustrated and unwilling to argue, she walked off in annoyance, telling him she would find her own ride back. While walking toward the highway, a pickup truck stopped beside her. The driver, a large man with a seemingly friendly demeanor, asked where she was going and offered her a ride. With few other options, Marlene accepted and climbed in. Once inside the truck, Marlene noticed the passenger door lacked handles or window controls. Though the detail struck her as odd, she dismissed it, too tired to give it much thought. Not long after, she drifted off to sleep. An hour or so later, Marlene woke up to find that they had stopped moving. Rather than being on the road to Lebanon, where her mother-in-law lived, they were parked on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. As she tried to process what was happening, the man ripped off her outer clothing. He then sliced off her boots and panties before raping her. Throughout the ordeal, Marlene had begged her attacker to let her go, telling him over and over again that she had a newborn waiting for her at home. Miraculously, her tearful pleas had worked. When the man was sated, he pulled back onto the highway and continued on toward Lebanon. After cautioning her to keep her mouth shut if she knew what was good for her, her attacker had dropped her off and driven away. Bursting through the door, she had told her mother-in-law what happened. The police were called, and Marlene was taken to the hospital to be treated for bruises and abrasions she had suffered during the assault. A rape kit was also performed, which confirmed that sexual contact had recently taken place. Even with her detailed description of the attack and the perpetrator, officers didn't believe Marlene's version of events. She had been drinking that evening, which led them to believe that she had concocted the story to cover up a sexual encounter with a stranger she had come to regret. Despite the fact that Marlene had identified John Aykroyd as her assailant, due to her inability to recall every last detail about both him and his vehicle, no charges were ever filed. It was a missed opportunity that others would pay for with their lives. In May of 1977, 14-year-old Rodney Grissom and his 15-year-old girlfriend Karen Lee ran away from their homes in Oregon, destined for sunny California. Young, wild, and free, they wanted to experience life to the fullest. Their last communication with family members was made from a payphone in Sweet Valley, which happened to be where John Aykroyd was living at the time. The pair haven't been seen or heard from since. Although what became of the couple is unknown, not long after they went missing, hikers found garments strewn along a desolate mountain road, including a pair of jeans that had been sliced down the middle. The remnants were positively identified as the clothes Karen was wearing when she left home on May 25th. Since Aykroyd was known to cut the clothing off of his victims, he is considered a possible suspect in their disappearance. Rodney Grissom's wristwatch, keychain, billfold with the cash still inside, and an ID card from the Bureau of Labor were later discovered in a rural area off the Lost Highway. To this day, the teenagers are classified as endangered missing. On February 19, 1978, the body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Musler was discovered in a shallow grave on the outskirts of Lebanon, Oregon. She had been missing since August 25, 1977, when she vanished in broad daylight. Her killer's identity remains a mystery, though it wasn't lost on investigators that she was found in the heart of Aykroyd's hunting ground. A skull was also uncovered in the same area that has yet to be identified. This nameless, faceless victim is known only as Snow Creek Doe. In another instance, a skull was found discarded alongside a pile of tattered clothing in a wooded area off the highway. Dubbed Swamp Mountain Doe, all authorities know is that she was a young woman who met with a violent death. Nothing more. On August 27, 1978, hunters stumbled upon the badly decomposed body of a woman partially buried near Finley Creek. Heavily pregnant at the time of death, she remains unidentified and unclaimed. For the past 45 years, she has been known simply as Finley Creek Doe. In 1984, a human skull, cache of bones, and a single tooth were found in the wilderness that surrounds the ill-fated roadway. Thanks to advances in DNA technology, the remains were identified as those of Wanda Ann Hare, who had vanished in the summer of 1976 at the age of 19. While no cause of death was evident due to the ravages of time, it was apparent that her demise hadn't been natural. In 1992, 2 years after Channy was last seen, 17-year-old Melissa K. Sanders and her best friend, Sheila Swanson, 19, went on a camping trip with Melissa's family to Beverly Beach State Park. Growing bored of the outdoors in short order, the girls called their boyfriends and asked them to take them back to civilization. When the boys refused, the teens decided to hitchhike. Since Sheila was deathly afraid of the dark, they waited till the sun came up before setting out for home. When Melissa's parents got up a few hours later and saw that the girls had taken off during the night, they hadn't been overly concerned. Independent spirits who were known to disappear for days on end, the behavior was nothing new. Figuring that they would turn up eventually, the family hadn't notified authorities. After 2 weeks passed with no word from the girls, Melissa's father reported her missing. While no one had bothered to do the same for Sheila, She was considered missing by association. Though she hadn't gone to police, Sheila's mother had printed up dozens of flyers, which she posted all around the town of Lebanon. It would later come to light that John Aykroyd had shown up at the state highway shop in Sweet Home on the night the girls were last seen, his hands and forearms covered in blood. A familiar figure at the stop where highway mechanics regularly parked their vehicles while on the job, he was easily recognizable to the employees on duty that evening. When one of the workers had asked what was going on, Aykroyd had replied that he had hit a deer. Rather than leaving the carcass on the road, he had gutted it before discarding the remains in the woods. Even though the explanation hadn't made any sense, the men had brushed it aside as just another example of John being John. After washing up in the restroom, Aykroyd had gotten into his truck and headed home. Months later, one of the witnesses that night, Marvin Larrant, had contacted authorities after hearing on the news that the bodies of two young women had been found dumped along the same route Aykroyd was traveling that night. Not surprisingly, the victims turned out to be the missing teenagers. Sheila was found with her ankles bound, a used rivet lying nearby. Crime scene technicians would conclude that the rivet matched those used by highway mechanics. Melissa's remains had been so ravaged by scavengers that she was no longer recognizable. The medical examiner surmised that the girls had been strangled to death, though the advanced state of decomposition made it impossible to know for sure. Unlike the other victims, Sheila and Melissa had known, and unfortunately, trusted John Aykroyd. Frequent patrons of a local hangout called Sherry's, they had seen him around enough to let their guards down. Believing that he was a good guy, they wouldn't have hesitated to accept a ride from him. Other regulars recalled overhearing the girls telling him about the camping trip and its location. Upon learning where they would be, Aykroyd had invited them to accompany him to a shindig near the campsite, but they had declined. Investigators noted that Melissa and Sheila would have been hitchhiking along US 101 leading to Highway 20. This was also the route Aykroyd took on his way to work each morning, putting them directly in his path. 2 weeks after Sheila and Melissa were found, Aykroyd was arrested for the murder of Kay Turner. His killing spree had finally come to an end. In 2016, just as prosecutors were preparing to indict John Aykroyd for the murders of Sheila Swanson and Melissa Sanders, their office received word that he was dead. With no defendant left to try, the case was closed. Ultimately, it's impossible to determine the full extent of the lives claimed by John Aykroyd. A remorseless predator, he exploited his role as a highway worker to target anyone unlucky enough to encounter him during his deadly hunts. His thirst for violence grew so uncontrollable that he eventually turned his focus to those within his own home. Though their lives were tragically cut short, the known victims, Kay, Sheila, Melissa, and Channy, along with others he is suspected of killing, will not be forgotten. Their existence held meaning, despite what their murderer may have believed. With time, may the focus shift entirely to their stories, leaving Aykroyd's name to fade into obscurity.